As COVID-19 cases surge in the United States, President Biden announces new action. And is the U.S. headed for a record number of gun shootings in 2021? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. COVID-19 continues to hammer the United States, with the Delta variant causing a rise in cases and hospitalizations across the country. This week, President Biden announcing a series of new steps that include a strict vaccine requirement for federal workers. The order will require them to show proof of vaccination or be subject to mandatory testing and mask wearing.
As I said from the beginning, a mask is not a political statement. It's about protecting yourself and protecting others. Masking is one defense against the spread of COVID-19. But make no mistake, vaccines are the best defense against you getting severely ill from COVID-19. The very best defense.
Later in the show, we will also address President Biden's response to a surge in gun shooting deaths that the U.S. has seen, and it's on a course to set new records this year. But we begin with the COVID-19 crisis. Joining us now from Washington, D.C. is Ameshia Cross. She's a Democratic Party strategist and commentator. With us from New York is Amy Holmes. She is a writer for HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, also a columnist for the Swiss weekly Die Weltwoche. Also with us from Wilmington, Delaware is Brandon Bryce. He is Director of Equity and Social Justice, Delaware Racial Justice Collaborative. And with us as well is Chris Hahn. He is the host of the Aggressive Progressive podcast. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Amy, why don't I start with you? You know, Biden came into office really committed to conquering COVID-19 in July. On the 4th of July, he said, you know, we basically got the upper hand on the virus, emerging from the darkness. He did say there was work still need to be done, but declaring independence from the deadly virus seemed like it was a foregone conclusion. And then all of a sudden, the vaccines kind of hit a wall. We saw the surge in the Delta variant. Give us your sense of what's going on right now with his signature issue.
Well, I guess you could say that President Biden just experienced his mission accomplished moment. You remember when George Bush unfurled that banner, and the mission is long from accomplished. And unfortunately, I think that there's bipartisan agreement that the Biden administration has really bungled this latest CDC guideline on masks, that we were told that now we need to mask up even if we're vaccinated, but without an explanation as to why and the underlying data. Well, now that's been provided today, but it seems to be raising more questions than answers. That if you are vaccinated, you are unlikely to get the Delta variant. If you do get the Delta variant, however, you're just as contagious as those people who are unvaccinated with the infection. So that ends up, throwing a lot of questions into the proper public policy towards this, which is something that really we have to decide together as a community because it affects us all. And I would say that this throws the whole entire vaccine passport issue out the window, because now you could be vaccinated, potentially carrying the Delta variant, and be infectious. So having a vaccine passport doesn't necessarily make you safe to everyone else.
Ameshia, is the administration having a messaging problem like Amy indicates?
Absolutely not. So full disclosure, my master's is in public administration and public health. And what we have to understand is that there is a foregone conclusion here that when people are not vaccinated, what ends up happening is that you have more variants that emerge more quickly. The virus is able to find hosts and to create new, more dangerous strains, the more people it can infect. What we do know is that for those who are vaccinated, they have less hospitalizations. The majority will never go to the hospital at all, and they're also asymptomatic. For those who are not vaccinated, it's the entire opposite. We have states, particularly across the South, that right now are having problems with having enough hospital beds based on the fact that you have so many people who are coming in who are unvaccinated, who are now in dangerous threats when it comes to COVID-19. Because a lot of those same people sent their kids to summer camps who are now coming back and spreading COVID-19 throughout their communities. So I think that what we need to do here is pause a little bit to first understand science and how vaccines actually work, but also to really lean into the science and not into conspiracy theories or right-wing rhetoric as it relates to why the CDC has changed its tune. Now, I do agree to a certain extent in terms of communication. I think that the CDC kind of bungled a bit when they told people not to wear masks, but we have to remember that mask guidance that came out just 2.5 months ago was for the vaccinated. They never told unvaccinated people not to wear it, yet unvaccinated people were largely in various parts of this country not wearing them to begin with. So I do think that there was something to be said about that. But science moves at the speed of light, and so does this virus. And more dangerous variants are likely to come if we don't start masking up and getting more people vaccinated now. We are very far from any level of herd immunity, and herd immunity is not determined by how many people just get it who are unvaccinated, but herd immunity by variant of getting that actual vaccine. Joe Biden was very strategic about it. His first 100 days, he surpassed his vaccine goals. And then come July 4th, we saw that taper off a bit because individuals, particularly in the South and particularly in areas where Republican-led legislatures were pushing against the vaccine and acting as though if you get it, you're somehow not a patriot. We also saw the emergence of a lot of Facebook and social media anti-vax campaigns and misinformation campaigns that also pushed things that were unscientifically found, that scared people and pushed them away from getting the vaccine. So the Biden administration is working against some very detrimental things right now, and our nation's public health is at stake.
Well, Ameshia, let me talk a little bit. Hold on for just a second, Amy. I just want to ask Ameshia about the masks in the sense that what's going on in St. Louis County. We just saw this earlier this week where the county executive himself said, you know, I'm going to try and put the virus in the slow lane. I'm going to reinstitute mask mandates. Then there was a vote among the county council. Let's watch a little bit of what happened earlier this week. And Ameshia, I want to get your reaction on the other side. All right, so you can see all these people celebrating as though they're at a St. Louis Cardinals game. That's because the county council voted nope on the mask mandates. Nobody in the audience wearing a mask. I want to get your reaction.
I think it's completely ignorant. I think that that's ignorant. I don't think that it's sound public health policy. I'm a native of Chicago. They're hosting Lollapalooza right now. It's 10,000 people a day at an outdoor concert series. That is also completely ignorant, and that is being led by and pursued by both a Democratic mayor in Chicago as well as a Democratic governor's leadership for the state of Illinois. It's bad policy whether you're in a Republican area or a Democratic one. We have to follow the science.
Amy, I want to give you a chance to, you wanted to jump in there. I want to give you a chance to.
Just as a point of clarification, when it comes to variants of the coronavirus, the Delta virus, in point of fact, as we know, came from India. And Scientific American, it reports that as long as the global population, the majority of which is not fully vaccinated, as long as that's happening, Americans will always be, and America will always be, at risk for these variants and these COVID viruses. What we do know is that vaccines are the best protection for the individual. It makes you less likely to contract the virus, and should you contract the virus, less likely to suffer severe or fatal effects.
Brandon, I want to ask you about a story that AP did about Osage Beach, Missouri. Vaccination rates are just terrible there. The Delta variant is running through that community like a runaway train. 23 people dying in the first 22 days of this month. It's a very small community. They interviewed 31-year-old Daryl Barker, and they interviewed him. He's hooked up to an oxygen machine, and he's barely able to actually give the sound bites, but he said, I was strongly against getting the vaccine because we're a strong conservative family. Do Republicans have a responsibility to kind of change these people's minds?
You know, I think the real issue here is that this is an issue where we're talking about public health. Unfortunately, it has become extremely politicized. And I can tell you, when you talk about communities, there's always been health disparities, but now COVID has literally shined the light on what those disparities are. I can tell you specifically in the African-American community, there is a fear of this vaccination. Now, the challenge is, I think, the solution is starting to look at what are the ways that we can actually educate the public about what actually is in the vaccine and just demystifying some of the myths that people are having right now. Because I can tell you, the longer that this issue becomes politicized, the more you're going to see people get sicker and the more that you're going to see people lose their life when they could have been informed rather than misled.
And so, Brandon, what's your suggestion in terms of reaching out to the Black community? What should the administration be doing?
Well, one of the things is education. It's funding programs that actually produce exposure to saying, okay, what is the vaccine? There are people that literally don't know what's in the vaccine. And that's, if you ask many African-American groups, they'll tell you that their challenge has been, we don't trust the vaccine. And so demystifying that, we're saving lives through educating people, getting the civic organizations involved to not just talk about COVID-19, but to talk about the variants, to talk about just overall public health, because one of the challenges that we're seeing when it comes to people's healthcare is that those people who are most impacted are those people who already had unhealthy lives. And so how do we begin specifically in the African-American community to begin to talk about better health options, better options as far as taking care of your daily health. And then on top of that, looking at COVID-19 from a public policy standpoint and not from a political standpoint. I can tell you right now, the best thing that our president can do right now is lead with facts and look at and push more information, more information and education across the public so that people have access and they know what the vaccine really is and not what the left or the right is trying to push.
And Chris, one of the efforts the president, we showed it as we were introducing you, trying to revive vaccination efforts with these new rules and mandates, including requiring federal employees to get vaccinated, or if they're not, they're going to endure some rather strict protocols. Is getting tough going to be the answer?
Look, we got to do something, right? People need to get vaccinated in this country. I think we're all in agreement that the vaccination is our best defense against COVID-19 and the variants that are popping up. So yeah, I do think that the president and other governments should issue vaccine mandates. We see a lot of private sector companies starting to do that right now. It's the thing to do. Look, here's the thing. Many of us have done everything we were supposed to do during this crisis. We locked down, we wore masks, we got vaccinated, we social distanced. And there are people who never did any of that. And those are the people who are primarily spreading these variants across this country right now and who will primarily be responsible for whatever comes next in our fight against COVID-19, should we have to have stricter measures as far as our movement around the country or the world. So it is very important that we do something to get them vaccinated. And I think it's funny that in the last week we've seen conservatives do a 180 on vaccination. They must have seen some polling data that was very scary to them, because we've seen people who would never in a million years come out for vaccination start to come out and say, look, I believe in science, get vaccinated. I appreciate it. It's better late than never, but it's time for us to all get real. But I agree with what was just said. The people in this country who are unhealthy are the ones who are most at risk. And those unhealthy people are also least likely to get vaccinated and least likely to do the things necessary to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So a lot of education, a lot of movement, and it cannot be politicized. It must be something done across the board.
Amy,
but it also can't be demonized. There's been a lot of vax shaming and calling people who have hesitancy, who have concerns, either because of their own prior bad experiences with medicine, or they need to learn more, or maybe they actually already had COVID and believe themselves to be immune, which they are, and therefore they don't need a vaccine. But it's not that mysterious in terms of how to approach this. We did this with HIV/AIDS, and one of the things that researchers found was that shaming people over their HIV status was a surefire way to keep them from doing the right things to protect themselves and the community. And the best way to do this is to encourage people with carrots, with positivity, and also at the grassroots level, and engage people in the community, in those vaccine hesitant community who are trusted to talk to their fellow community members and say, you know, this is going to make your life so much easier, so much better. Get on board with the vaccine. I got it. I'm doing well. You will too. But all of this vax shaming of who's ignorant and who's dangerous and so forth, that only deepens the divide and makes it less likely that people who are anti-vax are switched to the vaccination team.
Amy, I agree in the shaming section here. I do not believe we should shame people into getting the vaccine. But it is a fact that the people who are not getting vaccinated right now do not believe in science, do not take their health seriously in other areas.
And that is, we're not trying to take the health of those around them seriously.
And look, I'm not in the approach people to get vaccinated business. I'm in the political punditry business right now. So I'm not, if I was out there trying to encourage people to get vaccinated, I would do exactly what you said and exactly what was done during the HIV AIDS crisis.
Well, the thing
You're
is,
right
we have to
on the money
recognize
there.
that everything that Amy said in terms of community organizations, surrogates, people who look like the communities they're serving in, these things are being done, and they've been done for months now. At the end of the day, those same people are up against anti-vaxxers. They're up against conspiracy theorists that are being shown across social media, particularly targeting specific communities of color. They're up against access issues when it comes to people living in rural areas and not being able to have as much access to the vaccine or even the internet capabilities at the end of the day that have actually driven a lot of the vaccine outreach. We have to be real about the fact that none of these are new strategies, and none of these aren't strategies that have already been funded by the federal government or have already been advocated for and pushed through by the Biden administration. None of this is new. But when you're up against, and I keep hearing people talk about how this is turned political, it became political the moment that former President Donald Trump said COVID-19 was not a threat, that we were protected against it in the United States, and the fact that after he got the vaccine himself, he didn't tell anybody and acted as though you can just, once you get COVID, pop up outside and be absolutely fine. The fact that you saw so many people decide that they were not going to wear masks. Governors advocate for not wearing masks. Governors advocate for not having social distancing. Governors advocate for restaurants that did not have capacity limits. It became political when the Republican Party decided to make it so because they were chasing after Donald Trump.
Ameshia, a good point. Let me ask Brandon about that because just today, you know, when you're talking about social media, I looked online. There was a tweet from Madison Cawthorn, a Republican congressman from North Carolina. He said, no more masks, no more lockdowns. We, the people, want freedom. This is a rallying cry for a lot of lawmakers. They know they can get a lot of mileage out of it. But if you don't have some kind of uniform message and you do have it politicized, you're still going to have a huge problem out there, aren't you?
But I think that goes back to the problem is that, you know, when these are folks who want to get reelected. The challenge is that, you know, one thing that I'm surprised hasn't come up is this is a poverty issue because those individuals, and I actually have to disagree with my colleague when he mentioned these people don't want to know the science. No, I disagree with that. These people don't have the access and the means to get the information to know why or what or how. And until we address this issue of poverty as it relates to making sure that these populations are educated on what the vaccine is, are educated on where they can actually get the services and actually have the resources to be healthy and to keep their families healthy, we're going to see those numbers continue to soar.
Chris, I want to ask you about this comment from Cawthorn. You know, no more masks, no more lockdowns. We, the people, want freedom. I mean, you could substitute no more speed limits, no more seatbelts. We want freedom. Government does have a role to play. And I mean, I can remember coming into this business where I'd be around my colleagues. They'd be smoking like crazy. I mean, in this business, secondhand smoke. Now that just doesn't happen. I mean, the government does have a role here, don't they?
Absolutely. Look, Madison Cawthorn is the reason why we need to get rid of gerrymandering in America, because that walking frat paddle would never get elected in a district that was competitive, and he really needs to go. I don't like spending too much time talking about him because he's completely irrelevant. And but that said, a lot of people do follow him and take his advice and take him seriously, and it's a major problem. But you make an excellent point. We used to, you know, we grew up in a society where people would have smoking sections in restaurants, and it didn't matter where you sat, you got smoke inhalation. We learned, we developed. It took time, and now I think even people who are smokers understand the science behind that. We've got to break through to these people who are getting their news from unscrupulous news sources on social media and not really taking their facts. And I get it. Some of them are saying, well, the information being handed out by Fauci and the CDC has changed over time. Yes, of course it has. This is a brand new virus that has, and the science on it has continued to evolve as we've learned more about it. But people on the right, particularly the far right, the extreme right, the nonsense wing of the Republican Party like Madison Cawthorn and Donald Trump, have taken those changes and exploited them for political purposes and made it a rallying cry to get them likes on Facebook and Twitter and to get them votes. And it is ridiculous, and it is going to kill America.
I have to move on because we want to talk about another major issue, and that's the surge in gun shootings across the U.S. this summer that has the country on track to break new records in 2021. ABC News devoting a week of special reports to the subject they called One Nation Under Fire. Here's part of one report.
Gunshots, chaos, people running for their lives.
Where do we go? Where do we go?
3 wounded, a community stunned. Part of the chronic gun violence epidemic surging in recent months. The map shows it all unfolding. More than 1,000 incidents, more than 430 dead, 1,000 wounded. in 1 week.
Brandon, I know you were in Detroit for quite a while. I think the last time we talked to you, you were in Detroit. As a major city, that's where we're seeing a lot of this violence. What do you read into all of this?
You know, it doesn't matter if it's Detroit or Wilmington or Chicago or New Orleans. The reality is we've got an opportunity crisis in this country. And I'll lead with that. When we talk about gun violence, you know, I counter that to say how many of these people actually have equal opportunity and equal access to job training? You know, are we taking the skilled trades opportunity serious when we look at, you know, for cities that have African-American populations that are in 10 and 15%, but they make up 1 to 2% of the skilled trades. And so I think it's now time for the president, for governors, for mayors to start to work with civic organizations to give opportunities and more effort in how do we begin to employ these young people and even go as far as the education reform piece to give these kids hope and to give these young people hope, as opposed to investing on the back end. And unfortunately, we have not invested the dollars that we should have invested in training people and getting people exposed to careers, non-traditional careers that they may be in. And I can tell you, when we look at the number of African Americans who sit on corporate C-suites, who sit on executive boards, who serve in non-traditional roles, we have shortages across the country, and we wonder why gang violence has spiked.
Amy, I want to get your thoughts on this too, because the Washington Post reporting a 66% increase in gun sales in 2020 compared to 2019. A lot of people going up and gobbling up guns as the pandemic was approaching. They're expecting this to be one of the worst gun violence years in decades. What do you make of it?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily connect those two things, that you had last year a spike in gun purchases, in legal gun purchases, people who went through all the hoops, they did all the right things. And in point of fact, the highest rate of new gun purchases was in the African-American community. That was in part because of the pandemic and the fear of shortages. If you remember in the beginning, the shortage of toilet paper, for example. But it was also a reaction to some of the more violent protests that happened last summer in response to the George Floyd murder. But what we see with gun violence is oftentimes a euphemism for gang violence. And what Chicago researchers, for example, at the University of Chicago have identified, and it's been identified across the country, is that gun violence is epidemic in relation to gang violence. And one of the ways to bring that down is to intercede in gang rivalries before they escalate. And that's been proven to be very effective to, in fact, treat gun violence like a virus that needs to be stopped in its tracks, have a 24-hour cool down period. That's all been, it's been shown to be very effective. But I do want to make one last point with our previous conversation. MIT has done research into people who are vaccine hesitant. They are actually well informed, just as well informed as you might say, as people who've gotten the vaccination, but they interpret the data differently. And the highest rates of lack of vaccination are not people who watch Fox News and listen to Sean Hannity or follow this congressman's Twitter feed. It's actually highest among people 18 to 29 and African Americans. And it's most high, the highest, is young Black males in rural areas. That's partly because of history, because of a lack of access, and also just, I think, legitimate fears that, that they don't feel that they've been getting the straight news from our public health officials, particularly when some of them, like Dr. Fauci, admit that they lied to move the goalpost to try to get people on board.
All right. I also think young people have a tendency to think they're invincible, too. That kind of adds into the factor. Chris, let me ask you about this. Biden under pressure from the left to defund the police. Of course, the right saying we need law and order. How does he thread the needle here and come up with a solution without this becoming a huge political football, which it always does when it comes to gun violence?
Biden is not going to defund the police, and that slogan was ridiculous, and whoever came up with it should understand that they cost the Democrats seats in Congress that would have been very helpful right now to get their agenda passed. And quite frankly, we would have had more meaningful police reform efforts in the United States Congress should that slogan never have appeared in our political vernacular in 2020. So yeah, is there going to be pressure? Is he going to thread the needle? I think it's been remarkable to me how well the Democratic coalition has stuck together under President Biden. I think there's a real understanding among Democrats and progressives across this country that we've got to do everything we can to get things done, because the threat from the right, the threat from a Republican Party that is not at grips with reality and may or may not even support our actual republic is real. And I think Democrats understand that, and I think they're going to stick together. And while we might have our battles here and there on funding and finance, like you're seeing over the reconciliation bill happening right now, I think at the end of the day, Democrats are unified because Democrats understand that they are all that stand between this country and Donald Trump or a Trump-like person taking over and really limiting our freedom in the United States.
Well, Ameshia, let me ask you about one of the programs that the Biden administration is touting, the U.S. Attorney General going to Chicago, talking about a strike force plan by the Biden administration. The idea is to disrupt the flow of illegal guns in some of these major cities and actually reduce violence by prosecuting these gun buyers. I want to get your sense, that's something that's been talked about in the past. It doesn't really seem to have much traction. Is that the answer?
It doesn't have legs, and calling it a strike force is kind of wordplay. When we think of strike forces in America, largely we've thought of them as boots on the ground individuals who help to stop violence, who have federal authority to do so. Here they're talking about, without actually changing the law, being able to prosecute and push towards convictions for straw sales of guns. What we know, and what I know as a native Chicagoan, and this isn't something I read in some newspaper, I am a native, that is my home, I actually own a home there, is the fact that at the end of the day, a lot of the guns that are brought into Chicago are brought in illegally from states that surround Chicago. What we know is that the state of Illinois has these toughest gun laws in the entire nation. However, its surrounding Midwestern states do not. And at the end of the day, the illegal trafficking of guns that are in Chicago are not going to be buttressed by a strike force of sorts. What I do agree with that was said a bit earlier is that we have to recognize the social issues, the economic issues, the trauma that is happening in these communities. When you're talking about, for instance, my city, where you have the largest black male unemployment in the entire country, and this was pre-pandemic, where you have so much inter-community violence and gang violence. And when I say gangs, I don't mean 100+ people. These gangs have been identified by the FBI as having, in many cases, less than 10 people. They're just young people who surround themselves with the streets because, honestly, the after-school programs have been cut. A lot of the community resources have been cut. There are no jobs and there is no access to mental health care or anything else because the administration after administration has cut funding for that, as well as violence interrupter groups. The president of the biggest violence interrupter group in my city has been a good friend of mine for over 2 decades. He cannot get funding from the state to do his work. We know that these types of things, these types of initiatives, trauma-informed care and economic development are things that slow and reduce greatly gun and gang violence. The answer is not more cops on the street. The answer is not funding these policing entities more. At the end of the day, Chicago is one of the highest funded police entities in the entire country. And on top of that, it's also one of the highest violators of excessive force. Taxpayers in my city are paying millions of dollars a year to cover the tales of police officers who've literally brutalized communities of people who look like me. So at the end of the day, no, I don't agree with buttressing and trying to enhance a police force that has already been demonstratively a civil rights disaster. But I do think that we need to look forward to more human rights and more economic development in the city of Chicago and others.
We are going to have to leave it there. Thank you all. It was a lively discussion. Certainly appreciate it. Thanks so much for joining us on another edition of The Heat. Have yourself a great weekend.